Hello and welcome to Language of the Soul podcast. I'm your host, Dominic Domingo.
And I'm your co-host, Virginia Grenier.
We'd like to invite you to sit back, relax, and enjoy some inspiring conversation. Here at Language of the Soul, we know that life is story. Individually, we're the products of the stories we tell about ourselves. Culture is the amalgamation of the stories we weave about the human condition. Here's the thing. Individually and collectively, we can write our own story. Thanks for tuning in and joining in the march toward human potential. Hi guys, and welcome to Language of the Soul, where life is story. Thank you so much for joining us today. I want to give everybody a heads up in case, as I've said before, any of our listeners have abandonment issues. I will not be joining Virginia today due to scheduling conflicts, but she's going to man the interview herself. So I have all the faith in the world. She will keep up our track record because, we've had no duds. We've been very lucky. All of our episodes have been very inspiring, and this promises to be the same. So I'm going to read the guest's bio as usual, and then hand the interview off to Virginia. Okay, enjoy. Debbie Heisler is a dedicated author known for her impactful works, including Faith in the Middle and Whispers of Healing and Hope Grief Journal. Recognized as the USA Today 2023 Woman of the Year for the state of Utah, she's a passionate grief coach who provides support and guidance to those navigating loss. As the regional director for the Grandparents Community Network, Debbie actively advocates for families in need. She is also the co-founder of the Blue Butterfly House Supervised Visitation Center of Southern Utah, a vital resource for families facing challenges. A survivor of domestic violence, Debbie's journey informs her compassionate approach to helping others heal and find hope. Welcome, Debbie Heisler.
So the rote question that we pretty much have been asking everybody in our new season, so it kind of sticks to the whole premise of our podcast, which is about story, is so how would you say story relates to what you do professionally, and then of course how you encompass that in writing your current book as well?
So my story was actually the catalyst for what I do now, as well as the catalyst for writing my book. I currently do grief coaching, and I work with a lot of people in advocacy for grandparents raising grandchildren. And that keeps me really busy. And my book was intended to share our story so that others could learn from it and hopefully gain some insight to help them with their life struggles.
Right. Oh,
Pretty much.
That makes sense. And that's the big thing. I mean, usually when you're going through grief and dealing with those kinds of things, you do get really reflective of what's going on externally and internally. And so you are looking at past events, current events, and how that all intertwines within the story of our own fabric of our lives in very many ways. I know I had mentioned to you before, and I know you've read the book, The Body Keeps Score by Vander Klook, and how he talks about trauma, and it isn't just a memory stored in our mind, how it lives in our bodies and affects how we move through the world. And story is how we process that as well. So I've seen firsthand how stories help us unlock those deep-seated emotions, and then how it can be very cathartic and transformative, and how we externalize the pain that we're feeling and find the words to express it and to a form of release. And working with the people you work with in coaching through those grief situations, I'm sure you hear a lot of those kind of stories and see that happen quite a bit.
Absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, I was reflecting on that recently. A lot of people will make a comment that my pain is not the same as your pain. I didn't go through something so tragic and so horrific. And I often say, pain is pain.
Mm-hmm.
And we all have to learn how to navigate it. And it's pretty much the same process, no matter how horrific or how little you feel it affected you. It's still pain, both emotionally and physically.
Yeah, no, I understand that. Dominic and I both recently, well, not so recently. We're both coming. He just hit his year anniversary. I'm coming up to my year anniversary for my first parent. But we lost parents in 2024.
Mm.
Um, yeah. So, you know, not an easy thing to do, but I know you lost your son. And I obviously live in the area that, we both live in the same area out here where that happened. And that's one of
Mhm.
the reasons why you wrote your book. So if, and I know it's the premise of your book. So if you're okay, I'd love you to kind of walk us through that story and how writing that book helped you in that cathartic way of processing that grief. If you could, so our listeners understand um, kind of what you learned um, yourself that has helped you move forward and start the work that you're doing now with other
Yeah,
people.
yeah. Well, my book was actually a friend of mine said, you need to write a book. You need to write a book. It's such a multifaceted story where just to give a quick kind of recap, um, my son had been going through a custody battle with his ex, where it lasted almost 2 years in and out of court. And he ended up getting temporary custody with the mother having supervised visitation. And then they went to court to finalize uh, primary custody of my granddaughter.
Mm-hmm.
She was 6 years old at the time. And the court had ruled that he would be the primary caregiver and he would have primary custody.
Mm-hmm.
And 2 weeks later, the ex and two of her friends had constructed this plan and carried it out by breaking into our home where my son was by himself and kidnapping him. And they took him after they assaulted him to the Arizona mountains where they left him.
Mm-hmm.
And they didn't come clean. It took almost 9 days for us to put the story together, figure out what was going on. In the meantime, we searched for his body or him,
Mm-hmm.
and we ended up finding him about 8 weeks later.
Oh, wow.
It was a story that was supposed to be, I suppose, in their minds, they just wanted to scare him. But in reality, they took him across state lines, and that then opened up the justice system to three different agencies that would be investigating this, which was Arizona, Utah, and then the feds.
Mm-hmm.
And in reality, we were going to be faced with 9 trials.
Oh, wow.
And due to a lot of support from the district attorney and police and everybody, we were able to negotiate, and they included us in that, and negotiate that to plea deals with each of them. But all in all, it took about 3 years to go through that. And during that 3 years, I personally had learned a lot about the justice system, the way it worked, about grief, of course, about helping my granddaughter, a 6-year-old, with grief. My husband, we were all grieving all together and separately at the same time. And somebody suggested to me to write a book.
Right.
And I had no idea that it was going to be so therapeutic to do that. It really did help quite considerably. It was a 2-year process, to be honest, of writing the book and editing it with my editor. And each time we did a section, it was hard to process, but it was very, very helpful for me.
Well, and I'm sure when you talk about process too, because I mean, you're having to relive those moments, rethink about, and then of course you're, subjectively walking through it, and then you're trying to be objective at the same time as you're probably walking through each step of, what took place, and, the information that about and gathered as well. So you're dealing with that external and that internal process all at the same time in a subjective and objective pattern. It probably wasn't very
Absolutely.
easy. Yeah. Now I couldn't imagine trying to walk through a story on multiple levels, plus feeling the grief all at the same time.
Yes.
Wow.
Yes. Yes. Thankful I had a lot of support in therapy. I was also seeking therapy with my granddaughter.
Mm-hmm.
So it really helped quite considerably. I'd say the most poignant moments in writing this book were the moments where I saw it differently. I don't know how to explain that, except that, I had a process of dealing with this during the justice period. And that was to keep everything in my mind in order, chronologically in order, constantly. That was how I was dealing with it. And then when I sat down to write this book and had to recount, I realized a lot of things about how I got through that. And it's looking back, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like looking back at the process and going, wow, I really lived that. And I don't know how I did it.
So
And
it's like that reflective moment, and that's what's so cool about story and how cathartic it can be, because you can be reflective
yeah.
and see how it played out in those specific moments. I know, like Dominic in his book, which is what our podcast is based off, Language of the Soul. I know he talks about that. For him, that it was very cathartic in his writing process to when he was writing, and that there is always an unexamined level of the creative process that results in that catharsis. And he always and he says that Aristotle characterizes catharsis as the resolution of complexities. And he often said that if one does not learn or grow spiritually during the creative process, one may not have fully engaged in it. And so it sounds
Mhm.
like that's what you went through.
Yes. Yes. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep.
And I think that's great. And I mean, and that's the whole point. It's that self discovery that you make about yourself and about life. And of course, hopefully you're imparting that on the reader, and that they're able
Hmm.
to walk through that with you and see the world through your eyes.
Yep.
Yeah, no,
Absolutely.
that's great. I know narrative therapy is a process that does a similar thing. It's not sitting down and writing as an author or a nonfiction writer or a biography, someone who writes biographies would do, but it's a similar thing where you kind of look at the story of your life and learn to look at the narrative and reframe, reshape it, and look at how the connections happen. So when you're counseling and working with um, families that are going through grief, and it sounds like you're specifically focusing on grandparents that um, are dealing with grief. And I'm assuming it's because the same situation as you are taking in their grandchildren for various reasons. Do you kind of use that same premise, or walk me through kind of what the coaching is kind of like?
So currently, so I also wrote another book, which was a grief journal.
Mm-hmm.
And it was designed after about 3 years of writing in my own journal. um, I just felt compelled to help people walk through the process of grief. And I don't know, I just felt very connected to that. And so writing the journal helped me because that's how I got through a lot of this. Um, Writing in all forms, but writing in my journal was a great place to process. And so we really work a lot in my grief groups with the journal and going through the process of, um, reflecting our emotions and coping strategies and how to do self care,
Mm-hmm.
how to be mindful, and then, giving them hope and connecting them in the community, which is a little bit about the advocacy as well,
Mm-hmm.
helping grandparents. But I don't just do grief coaching with grandparents, it's open to anyone um, in my grief groups. So,
No, that's good. No, makes sense. Because obviously you don't want to eliminate, because grief is for everybody.
yeah.
And grief doesn't, obviously most people experience grief when you do lose a loved one, when someone dies, but grief comes in so many forms. I know um, in my training in mental health counseling, you see grief when you lose a job and,
Yeah.
because of being fired. You can have grief happen when you move. I know I experienced it when I moved from California to Utah.
Hmm.
Because I had to leave. I mean, that's where I was born and raised. I was walking away from lifelong friends. Even though I was excited for a new adventure, there was still that process of grief. And I'm sure, and grief is interesting, especially when it comes to death. Everybody talks about the stages of grief, and I'm sure and you can speak to this even more. Um, but it's not really stages. It's definitely more of a cycle, because you don't experience them in a stage of one, two, and three,
Right.
and
It's not linear.
no, definitely not linear. And nor is it like, oh, I'm in shock and then I go to anger and then I go to denial, or um depression, and then I go to bargaining. Like, you can go from denial to anger back to shock, and then next thing you know is like you're accepting, but then now you're angry again, and then you go back to now you're
Yeah.
despair. I'm like, you jump around.
Yes.
It's an interesting dynamic how it works.
It's very interesting. In fact, when um, this all first happened, and I put my granddaughter in play therapy very young,
Hmm.
and I would pick her up from her play therapist, and she'd say, "Oh, she went through the process about 20 times." Like they can, they go through the cycle of that process over and over and over.
Hmm.
And sometimes you get stuck in one, or sometimes you just can blast right through every single one of those. It's amazing, actually, what our mind will do.
Yeah. And it can come up years later.
And it definitely will wait for you.
Yeah, because I'm sure you probably have those moments still where you're driving down the street or you're, making breakfast or something and a wave hits you of one of those cycles.
Absolutely. We
Yeah.
all, yeah. It's something that we move forward with, not get over.
Right. So I'm curious because I know for me, in my moments of grief, especially since losing, and here I go, well, I'm getting emotional because it's still pretty raw for me. Losing my stepdad and then my mom literally 3 months later. Um, when I feel this emotion, when I'm able to talk about those memories, those stories I have of them, it helps put those things aside.
Yeah. Yeah. We do a lot of work about memories because I really believe how I've personally have managed to move forward through my grief is that I feel my son close to me in memory all the time. We've done so much in his honor that we feel like he's there with us all the time. Does that replace him being there? No. But it's, I'm not exactly sure how to put this, but it's like the love that we've had is just, it stays with us. And the grief process, we kind of, especially in the very early new stages of grief, we can't understand that.
Yeah.
We can't wrap our brains around that. So in our groups, we take the time to walk through all the stages. We focus on them, but we don't give anyone any time limits or any limitations to how they can feel it and how they can share it with others. Our groups are pretty powerful in here. And every single person we've been doing this for almost a year. It's been March. And every person that's committed the time to being here has really, really started to grow in self-love, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Love is going to get us through this, right?
Right.
No matter what. But self-love is so important. And it's amazing to watch. I can't explain it any other way other than to share different experiences maybe that some of our group has done. But they've done some amazing things. That's I don't really know how to explain it further, but their self-love is evident and it's helping them.
Yeah. No, and that makes sense. I've currently been reading some different books, and right now my professors have been having me focus on because I'm working on my counseling skills some more. And so the professors that I'm working with, they have us focusing on Gestalt and client centered and rational emotive therapy. So those are the three therapy skills that they have us kind of focusing on currently. And all of them talk about like, the past, and I'm just kind of grouping them all together, but all of them talk about basically what's in the past is in the past, and now we need to be in the present. And so we need to work ourselves from the past. And, each of them have their own different viewpoints of how that is done, of course. But it's about bringing ourselves into the present. And however long it takes, the client, so the person to get there, the individual,
Hmm.
and then to understand, like, and in most cases, this is pretty much the viewpoint that whatever A is, so whatever the reasoning is, be it a belief, ideology, a statement, a rational, event or statement of self, there's usually a point B that is really the core behind the emotion, the basic emotion that they're feeling, the hurt, the anger, the want.
Hmm.
Um, and, grief is usually, part of that. That's the hurt part of
Yes.
it. And the other are always, which of course goes into that whole cycle of the grieving cycle. The other ones are always there. They're always
Yeah.
circling around each other. They're always doing that dance with each other. Um, and so it's that awareness, and understanding that and being present and being okay with that. That's probably the biggest thing I've taken away um, in my training, and especially um, losing my parents and then going in and focusing on my counseling skills currently, um, was because that was the big thing with my professors. Like, are you sure you want to be doing these classes right now? Because just lost parents and you signed up for this, I know beforehand, but all this just happened. And I'm like, no, I'm committed, and this will be good for me and stuff. And they're like, okay. And I've been learning it's okay to not be okay.
It
Like,
is.
it's okay to be, and to let people know that, like, to
Hmm.
be authentic, to be honest, to be transparent. And it's so hard to show people that rawness because we do. I think as we want to connect with people, but at the same
Hmm.
time we worry how other people are going to see us in the world.
Absolutely. I just put out a little ebook for people that are dealing with new grief,
Mm-hmm.
because one of the things that I have learned is that when you are in new grief, you don't know how to express to others what you need.
Mm-hmm.
We People will always say, "Do you need anything?" or "How can I help you?" or "How can I support you?" And your answer is usually, "What? I'm good," or "It's okay. I'm fine," whatever the case might be. But there are a number of ways that people can support you in grief that don't include making you feel like you should have already moved through grief, or um, making you feel less than. And so my little ebook has a lot of tips of how, if somebody offers support, how you can answer that.
I like that. And I kind of wonder, with, I mean, I think even, going out to the macro level of society, um, you know, the hurt, the decisiveness we see, um, when people feel slighted, it some of that is grief. I think, they
Hmm.
don't recognize it as that, but in truth, that's what it is. It's, you know, they they want to be connected. We all want to experience that connectedness, the
Correct. Yeah.
human experience, but we don't know how to do it. We put those walls up. We don't
Hmm.
allow ourselves to
Absolutely.
support and lean on each other.
Yes. It is
And
the truth.
yeah, and it unfortunately it does. It divides us, and it doesn't allow us to move forward and and as Dominic and I always talk about, like that march to the human potential of what we can become.
Hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. Um, so to kind of go back to story,
Hmm.
um, you talked about how you have the grief journal.
Hmm.
So I know, like, as a writer, when I sit down to write, fiction, and I know it's very different from journaling or nonfiction writing. You know, a
Right.
lot of times writers will go like to a coffee shop and you've got the buzz and you have to kind of tune that out and stuff. So when you're dealing with grief and you're doing a journal, you know, obviously you've got that noise in your own head. And
Mhm.
what would be some tips to help quiet your mind, to help somebody to journal, to be able to get in touch with that awareness, to be able to put pen to paper or fingers to keyboard?
Yeah. So I had to struggle with that a little bit in the very beginning when my friend suggested that I start journaling because
Mm-hmm.
I hadn't really done it as a practice. And she said, you have to use pen to paper. And I really do support that because there is something that happens in your mind between your mind and your hand when you're writing.
Mm-hmm.
And it it's almost like um, I've caught myself several times writing in my journal, and all of a sudden I'll be like on one thought, and the next thing you know, I'm writing this entirely different thought, and it's turned into 2 or 3 pages. And I'm like, did I just write that? And it's it's very different pen to paper.
Okay.
That being said,
Mm-hmm.
I set aside an hour in the morning before anybody gets up from my home and
Mm-hmm.
in a quiet space where I can fully be present with my book. And I start my journal every day with the same quote. And it says, I am grateful for the love, abundance, and joy that finds me today. I'm open, I receive. And I start my journal every morning that way. And that puts me in that mindset. And then once I start writing, some days I might write a half a page. Some days it just, like I said, my hand just goes nuts and I'm doing 3, 4 pages. And it's really just something I don't come back and look at, to be honest with you. I will write in my journal and I've filled many,
Mm-hmm.
and I very rarely go back to them because I feel like it's almost like a brain dump
Mm-hmm.
where I've written it, and if I needed to process it, it was 3 or 4 pages long, and then I can move on from it. It's pretty interesting.
No, I love it. Do you think you'll ever go back and reread anything that you've ever, you know, kind of brain dumped onto those pages?
Well, I had to do that a little bit
Mm-hmm.
as I was writing my book.
Mm-hmm.
It did give me some guidance, so it was essential in getting the facts that I wanted to get into the book correctly. Um, but there are moments where I'll write things in there that I intend to come back to, but inevitably, I'm the type of person that if I wrote it down, it's really ingrained in me, and I'm okay to go back if I need to, but I don't often need to.
Okay, that makes sense.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm opposite. I'm the type that, well, I used to be. I can't say that, I guess now that I'm older, but when I was younger, it was like if I wrote it down, I forgot it.
Oh,
It was like out of sight, out of mind. So it was like it
uh-huh.
left my brain. But
Mhm.
now I find if I write it, it does stick more in my brain now that I'm older. So I guess it's because, you know, the memory receptors are different in my brain.
Right.
So the connections, you know, memory gets different when you get old. As we
True that.
yes. I'm gonna switch gears a little bit,
Yeah.
and go to some things that Dominic had kind of mentioned to me. So, um, going back to kind of the situation that happened with your son and the premise of your book, and talking about society. So we know that society often sweeps things under the carpet, especially when it comes to dysfunction in families and domestic violence issues, especially in the 80s and 90s. we're both Gen X kids. So we grew up with the talk shows like Donahue and Oprah
Mm-hmm.
Winfrey. And they did shed a lot of light on um, those issues. They put them under that microscope. So in 2024, we started seeing more of that shame, and the stigma had been removed from trauma, dysfunction, mental health issues, and even neurodivergence, which was a great thing. People started talking about being more mindful. People started talking about being more socially aware,
Mm-hmm.
whole body wellness, which is a great thing. We started seeing suicide prevention. We started seeing people talking about, trauma, and, the Me Too movement happened, all those kind of things. However, we know that some people say we've gone way too far in our transparency, that we're airing our dirty laundry, that society rewards brokenness. What do you say to that, considering what you've gone through, working with people who've gone through different forms of grief? Do you think it's been helpful? Do you think,
Absolutely.
okay.
Yeah, I 100% believe in speaking up.
Mhm.
Um, my book starts with my own personal story of domestic violence when I was 19. My first marriage was 6.5 years of domestic violence.
Mhm.
And I never spoke up. I never spoke a word about it, actually, until I was trying to leave. I remember going through many, many, many episodes where people would just look the other way.
Mm.
I lived in an apartment building where there were other people that could hear everything going on and nobody did a thing.
Mm.
In today's society where we are bringing it up, we are making people aware, it's more important than ever. Because domestic violence has been on the rise, people should be aware. And
Right.
speaking up is a matter of life and death in some cases.
Yeah.
And how can that be wrong?
Right. And I kind of wonder too if it's the people who maybe are on that side of, we're airing our dirty laundry, is because it's making them uncomfortable for
Yeah,
whatever reason.
absolutely.
And it's maybe they need to look at that discomfort and why it's uncomfortable to them. Maybe it's because they are in that situation,
Mm-hmm.
they're a perpetrator of that situation.
Or they know somebody
Exactly.
and they haven't spoke up.
Yeah. No, that's very true. I totally agree with you. And but needed to ask the question because everybody has a different viewpoint. And of
Mm-hmm.
course, that's what we're here to do in this podcast is we want people to be aware and to, of course, we want people to our goal is to understand why we are that, have the interconnectivity amongst us, because I think we forget sometimes that we have more similarities than differences, no
Correct.
matter what our cultural backgrounds are, what our religious backgrounds are, what our ideologies are, that ultimately deep down are, basic human needs and feelings are the same.
Absolutely. I wholeheartedly agree with that.
Yeah. What are some examples when it comes to mourning and grieving that don't involve death, um, rather, um, that are other forms of loss? I know I covered a few at the beginning, but what are other ones that you've encountered?
Oh, well, personally, as well as in our groups, the loss of obviously pets. Pets is a huge loss to people. They become very emotional, as well as loss of jobs. and family members, not in the sense that they've passed on, but they've broken ties with family members. And those are some of the instances. One of mine was definitely job loss. I had, I built a career in real estate from 2000 on up to when my son was killed in 2016. And I was a broker for a real estate company. And after my son was killed, I went through obviously a lot emotionally, and I tried to return to work, and I ended up losing my job because I wasn't 100% the person I was before. And while that sounds really harsh, I've learned through life that uncomfortable that we were just talking about, people have a difficulty when it comes to dealing with people who are grieving, who are emotional. They don't know how to handle that or process that. And that resulted in me losing my job, a career that I had built.
Wow.
And I've seen that with other people in my groups where not only did they lose a loved one, but life took such a drastic turn. And for what other reason, it could be just fighting about estates, or, there's so many dynamics to the loss of a person that also compound the grief, that it's really hard. So those are just some of the things that I've seen.
Right. So here's something, because you just mentioned, like part of, the grief process is those who aren't grieving, you interact with those people and they don't know how to handle somebody who is.
Yeah.
It seems like there isn't much focus on that, actually. When you said that, I started realizing, wow, I'm just realized there isn't much talk about that.
Yeah.
And I started realizing that's probably because as a society within our Western culture, we kind of downplay grief. Like, I don't want to say it's a taboo because it's not, but we don't. I mean, there's obviously there's in other cultures. So I have a child who is Filipino, and in that culture, I mean, they don't have whalers. I can't remember what the term is because it's been a long time since I've been around my child's father, because I'm not with them anymore, but similar to whalers, but there's a different term that they use. But anyways, where the body's in the living room, they sleep with the body, they have people
Oh, right.
cry. It's not it's very common in a lot of the Pacific Islander culture for that. Each one's different how they handle that, but that part is all pretty similar. And so, some it's very much a celebration. Some, I know at least with this with my ex's Filipino family, it was a little bit more grieving with celebration later. But it seems like in ours is very much like we all wear black.
Yeah.
It's sad. I mean, you literally you know, like the perfect funeral is the skies are gray and it rains.
Yes.
Like,
Yeah.
I
Right.
mean, that's like, it is dreary. And,
Right.
it's like really,
It's like the gloom and the doom, and
yeah,
matching the mood of the moment.
exactly. And
Yeah.
I think about that and I'm going, maybe that's why societally people don't know how to handle someone who is going through grief that isn't a part of that grieving process with that person. They feel uncomfortable in it. Um, can you kind of talk about that a little bit, and what you've experienced, what you've
Well,
learned from that?
also, that we all grieve so differently
Mm-hmm.
that it is such an independent experience. And even in my own household, where the three of us were grieving, it was so different. And trying to balance our grief and trying to create a new normal in our life was like a complete act. You had to figure out what minefield you could walk through with that person. And I would think just knowing the dynamics of families, for instance, like if there's an estate that needs to be settled, it always seems like there's family members that are fighting, and it always seems like it's over money and things. But in essence, I believe it's more about the grief. It's more about not handling each other's grief and being um, compassionate with one another.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, there's the dynamic of money and belongings that are left behind, or what to do, and then there's inevitably in every family that one child who was the caretaker, or um, that takes control over a family.
Mm-hmm.
And there's always this struggle that happens. And I always come back to, it's not always about, we have to realize we're all grieving. And what does that mean for you? What does that look like for you? Does it look like you're lashing out at other people? Possibly.
Mm-hmm. That
Does it
makes
look like
sense.
we're fighting over things? Possibly.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Different personalities, different grief
Yeah.
processes. And
Uh,
we don't talk about that either.
no, we don't.
We just fight.
Yeah. And it seems like we often, so to kind of come back around a little bit, we often explore here on this show, the art of self-regulation.
Mhm,
And obviously that has to do with our emotions, which is exactly what we're talking about. I mean, grief is an emotion,
mhm,
and people express emotion very differently. So how we manage our emotions and our reactions through creative outlets, emotional outlets, all become entangled. I know I've found that for me, storytelling can be a powerful tool for grounding myself in moments of emotional turmoil. Um,
mhm.
it sounds like you kind of found that as an outlet for you when you wrote your book.
Right.
Um, so, what are other ways for people to find that sense of calm or that sense of control amidst the chaos of their grief?
Creativity, that's always a big one. We do watercolor journaling.
Mm-hmm.
Just any kind of creative outlet that you can find is always going to help you process in some way. It's, if you don't journal, try something, painting, or um, coloring books, even like the adult coloring books or things like that. Just using your creative side of your mind is a great way to bring yourself into regulation. Um, Also, learning grounding, learning breathing techniques, learning different
Mm-hmm.
ways to um, be aware of your emotions, because a lot of people don't have that awareness at all. And when you're
Mm-hmm.
aware, um, you can do, creative visualization, you can do exercise, you can do um, just grounding techniques of any kind. There's just a number of ways that you can bring that around. And that's one of the things that we do here in my grief group, is
Mm-hmm.
we learn these ways.
Right. Oh, I want to go back to the watercolor and doing kind of the creative activities where it's art based, because that's that whole left right brain. So
Mm-hmm.
your
Yep.
logical, more rational brain versus your more creative abstract um, brain. So what is it about using more of the abstract creative processing that versus using more of that logical rational side of your brain that helps with grief? Like what have you learned in your grief coaching techniques that helps people work through it? Like what is it about that?
Well, what we do, we usually do it in a group setting.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so interesting to see how everyone perceives what subject we are drawing and painting, and then they put their own words to it. And it's just something about taking the time. It regulates your heartbeat. It just keeps you in the moment, where a lot of times we don't stay in the moment. And that's another part of processing emotions, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, so it is just incredibly wonderful to watch them. They each get a grief or a watercolor book, and then every time we have another class, they bring the book, and they can go back and see different parts about themselves, because we write journaling in with the watercolor, so they can go back and look at that. And it's just a creative process of, I would say, coming into yourself.
Mm, yeah, and I love that. And I think that's so true. We talked about that earlier today when Dominic was doing another podcast with a guest, Cheryl Murphy. He shared with me that they're also talking about that same thing about, it's so important to have that self-awareness and being in the moment and being present,
Mhm.
um, because I think that's what we're afraid of is sometimes is facing what's in front of us right at that time, in that
Yes,
present reality. It's easier
yes,
to retreat versus to stay present. And
stay
I don't,
present.
yeah. So I just love that. And maybe it's just because it's that vulnerability, um, because vulnerability is a gateway to connection.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I at least that's how I know I feel sometimes. Do you feel like, when you, because obviously, I mean, you're putting yourself out there. I mean, do you feel like that's opening doors for you and unexpected and giving you unexpected opportunities and unexpected conversations that you never thought you would see because you are being vulnerable and basically
Yeah.
allowing that to happen?
Oh, yeah. It has been it has been an interesting adventure. I've had to I sit back and I'd be like, wow, I wouldn't have met these people had I not done this. When I opened up the Blue Butterfly House, that was an incredibly cool experience, because it brought people through the door that wanted to help, that I would have never been in a position to be in the same room with. And I would have never known that the commonality there was that they had experienced something in their life that gave them a passion to be there.
Hmm.
I just would never have known that about somebody. And the same goes with my grief groups. And, I people that have come through my door, and I'm like, I would have never known that about you. You put on such a beautiful, brave face, but here you are being so raw and vulnerable with me. And I'm just so grateful that I'm in a position to receive that, sit with that, and support that. It's
Well,
amazing.
Yeah, and they're trusting you. They're trusting you
They
with that
trust.
vulnerability.
Yeah.
Yeah. You mentioned the Blue Butterfly House. I know what that is, but for our
Yes.
listeners, especially the ones that don't live in this area, can you share what that is?
Yes, absolutely. So it's a supervised visitation center where families come to be monitored by a third party if they're court ordered to have supervised visitation, whether it be from um, substance abuse or they've got domestic violence issues or there's just some issue the court deems them unable to be with their children safely one on one. And it's something that was very close to my heart, um, having to be a supervisor for my son's ex when she was going through, when we were all going through the custody.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I was that supervisor, and there was nothing available to us here
Mm-hmm.
for a third party other than using the Child and Family Services. And if you didn't have a Child and Family Services case, um, you had nowhere to go. There was like
Yeah.
no place that you could go that was safe.
Mm-hmm.
And it was important for me to create something safe for families
Mm-hmm.
after my son's death.
Yeah. Which, by the way, thank you for, because I was a victim advocate for a number of years in the area. So I referred families there very
Yeah.
often for that reason. So thank you for creating that.
Well, you're welcome.
I mean, it was obviously under unfortunate circumstances, but it has been a great asset to our community. And I hope other communities have done something similar. And if not, and you're listening, please do.
Yes.
Because it's been a valuable asset for our whole county. Um, is there, we're kind of getting to the top of the hour here, so
Hmm.
I'm just kind of curious, is there anything that you would like to impart to our listeners? Any um, additional insights that we haven't covered that you feel are important for them to know about, understand?
It was actually something that I had learned recently through the holidays that I wanted to just share that I thought was it just was so eye-opening to me. So I know that grief is both physical and both emotional.
Mhm.
Um, and everybody who comes through my door, they have all kinds of um, both issues.
Mhm.
And right before the holidays, I hurt my sciatic nerve. I I irritated it, whatever, and I sprained my back. And I had such intense pain in my back. And I was just kind of reflecting. And every movement that I made had to be calculated. Every single time I sat down, I had to go through the mechanics of sitting every time
Mhm.
before I could successfully sit without pain. And I thought about that and how that equates to people that are going through emotional and physical pain, and how when someone is grieving the loss of a loved one, it is very much the same. The pain is real, it's hard at the beginning,
Mhm.
and you have to actually sit down and think about the mechanics of life again. You have to walk through the new without the spouse or the child or whomever you lost that you love. It is completely new. And you have to break it down into tiny little steps in order to get through it. And that's what we do here. And I really wanted to impart that on everybody that no matter where you are, if you've lost someone or something, that getting help to break it down to tiny little steps is super important to getting through it.
Oh, I love that. I love that. I wanted to comment on that, but I don't, because I don't want to take away from it either. Because I'm like, oh, I can so relate to that in so many ways. But that
Right.
was just beautiful, you said. So I'm gonna leave it there.
Hey,
But no, Debbie, thank you for coming on. I know we've been trying to get to this, to having you on to do this episode. I think it's been great. Grief is something that a lot of people go through, especially we just had the holidays. People experience this. The holidays are always tough for everybody.
yes,
So
yeah.
hopefully those who got through them, pat yourselves on
Mhm.
the back, because it's tough, but you did it.
Mhm. You did it.
Yes, you did it, and hopefully, this episode has helped you. You were able to get some golden nuggets out of it, and you can keep plugging forward. Thank you, Debbie, for coming on. It's been a pleasure. And I
Thank you
definitely
for
will keep
having me.
absolutely, and I will keep in touch with you for sure. And yeah, thank you so much.
Okay. Well, you have a beautiful night.
You too.
And for our listeners, remember, life is story, and we can get our hands in the clay. Individually and collectively, we can write a new story. See you next time.
We want to take a moment to thank our wonderful listeners and supporters. Your continued support and sharing of our podcast helps us spread the transformative power of storytelling. If you enjoy our episodes, please rate and review us on your favorite platform and share the podcast with friends and family. For more enriching conversations and insights, subscribe to Language of the Soul podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, and anywhere you listen to podcasts. Follow us on social media and visit our Patreon website for the latest updates and exclusive content. Your support helps us continue to bring these important stories to life. If you'd like to support us further, consider joining our Patreon community for exclusive content and donation options. Every bit of support helps us reach more hearts and minds.